My 3 adult children told me they didn't need me anymore over Sunday brunch. They said I was clingy, overbearing, and that it was time I learned to live my own life. I smiled, nodded, and quietly excused myself to the restroom. What I did in that coffee shop bathroom 20 minutes later would change everything they thought they knew about their comfortable futures. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Sunday in Millbrook Heights. I had spent 3 hours preparing the perfect brunch spread in my sunroom, the same way I'd done every week for the past 5 years since my husband Marcus passed away. Fresh croissants from the French bakery downtown, homemade quiche with herbs from my garden, mimosas with the expensive champagne I saved for special occasions with my children. At 62, these weekly gatherings had become the highlight of my existence, the one constant thread connecting me to the 3 people I loved most in this world. Victoria arrived first, as always, her designer heels clicking against the marble foyer of the house Marcus and I had built 35 years ago. My eldest daughter looked impeccable in her tailored blazer and pencil skirt, every strand of her auburn hair perfectly in place. She worked as a senior partner at one of Denver's most prestigious law firms, and she wore her success like armor, never letting anyone forget how far she'd climbed from her middle-class origins. "Hello, Mother," she said, offering me the customary air kiss that never quite touched my cheek. "The house looks lovely as always, though I do think you might consider updating that wallpaper in the dining room. It's very dated." I had chosen that wallpaper with Marcus 20 years ago during a romantic weekend in Tuscany. We'd fallen in love with the delicate vine pattern in a small boutique and had it specially imported. But I simply smiled and thanked her for the suggestion, as I always did when Victoria offered her unsolicited improvements to my life. Thomas bounded in 15 minutes later, his energy filling the room despite his 31 years. My middle child had inherited his father's easy charm and quick smile, though he'd never inherited Marcus's work ethic. He was dressed in his usual uniform of expensive jeans and a cashmere sweater, paid for by the generous monthly allowance I had been giving him since college. He was supposedly working on a screenplay, though in the 8 years since graduation I'd yet to see a single page of his great American novel. "Mom, you've outdone yourself again," he said, wrapping me in a hug that felt genuine. "Is that your famous hollandaise sauce? You know I've been craving it all week." My youngest, Rebecca, arrived fashionably late, as was her habit. At 28, she was the artist of the family, or at least that's how she introduced herself at parties. She'd graduated with a fine arts degree that I'd funded entirely, and now she spent her days creating abstract paintings in the converted garage studio I'd built for her behind my house. She lived in a trendy apartment downtown that I subsidized, driving the BMW I'd bought her for her birthday, wearing clothes purchased with the credit cards I faithfully paid each month. Sorry, she said, breezing in with her wild curls barely contained and paint still visible under her fingernails. I was in the middle of a creative breakthrough. You know how it is when inspiration strikes. We settled into our usual spots around the glass table in the sunroom, surrounded by the flourishing plants I tended with the same devotion I'd once given to raising my children. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in a warm glow that made the gathering feel intimate and precious. For the first hour, conversation flowed as it always did. Victoria updated us on her latest high-profile case, dropping names of important clients and judges as if we were all supposed to be impressed. Thomas regaled us with stories about the celebrity he'd supposedly met at some trendy bar, weaving tales that grew more elaborate with each telling. Rebecca described her latest artistic vision, using words like transcendent and paradigm-shifting, to describe paintings that, to my untrained eye, looked like colorful chaos. I listened with the rapt attention I'd always given my children, asking questions, offering encouragement, playing the role of the devoted mother who found everything they did fascinating. I refilled their glasses, replenished their plates, and basked in their presence like a plant turning toward the sun. It was during the second mimosa that the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Actually, Mom," Victoria said, setting down her glass with the deliberate precision she used in boardrooms, "there's something the 3 of us need to discuss with you." Something in her tone made my stomach clench. Rebecca and Thomas exchanged glances, and I noticed they weren't meeting my eyes. The easy atmosphere of moments before had shifted into something formal and uncomfortable. Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? Victoria cleared her throat, assuming the role of spokesperson that she'd naturally claimed since childhood. We've been talking and we think it's time we had an honest conversation about boundaries. Boundaries? I repeated, genuinely confused. What kind of boundaries? Well, Thomas jumped in, his usual cheerfulness replaced by an awkward earnestness. We feel like maybe you've been a little too involved in our lives lately. Like, we're all adults now, and sometimes it feels like you're still treating us like kids. My heart began to pound, but I forced my voice to remain steady. Can you give me an example? I thought I was being supportive. Rebecca leaned forward, her artistic hands gesturing as she spoke. It's like every decision we make, you want to be consulted. Every problem we have, you want to solve. We love you, Mom, but we need space to figure things out on our own. Victoria nodded approvingly at her sister's diplomacy before delivering what felt like a carefully rehearsed speech. We've discussed this extensively, and we think it would be best if we stepped back from these weekly brunches. Maybe we could do monthly dinners instead. Give everyone some breathing room. The words hit me like a physical blow. These Sunday gatherings were the cornerstone of my week, the moment when my empty house filled with laughter and love. Without them, what would I have? Endless days of gardening and reading, occasionally punctuated by charity committee meetings filled with women I barely knew. But I enjoy our time together, I managed to say. I thought you did too. We do, Thomas said quickly, though his eyes were still focused on his plate. It's just that we think it might be healthier for all of us to have some independence. Independence from what? The question came out sharper than I intended. From having someone who cares about your well-being? From having a mother who wants to be part of your lives? Victoria's expression hardened, revealing the steel beneath her polished exterior. See, this is exactly what we're talking about. The guilt trips, the emotional manipulation. We can't have a simple conversation about healthy boundaries without you making it about your feelings. Emotional manipulation? I stared at my eldest daughter, wondering when she'd become this stranger who spoke to me like I was an opposing counsel to be defeated, rather than the woman who'd raised her. Mom, you have to understand, Rebecca said, her voice taking on the patient tone one might use with a difficult child. We're not rejecting you. We're just asking for space to be adults. You did your job raising us. Now it's time to let us live our own lives. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower. I looked at each of my children in turn, searching their faces for some sign of the love I'd thought we shared. Instead, I saw impatience, mild guilt, and something that looked remarkably like relief, as if they'd finally worked up the courage to have a conversation they'd been avoiding for months. I see, I said finally, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. And this is something you've all agreed on? They nodded in unison, presenting a united front that left no room for negotiation or compromise. Well then, I continued, standing up slowly, I suppose I should respect your wishes. If you'll excuse me, I need to use the restroom. I walked calmly through my house, past the family photos that lined the hallway, past the living room where my children had played as toddlers, past the kitchen where I'd made.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Thousands of meals with love and care. In the powder room, I stared at my reflection in the antique mirror Marcus had found at an estate sale in Vermont. The woman looking back at me had silver hair that I'd let grow naturally instead of dyeing it, laugh lines around her eyes from decades of smiling at my family's jokes, and an expression of dawning realization. For 62 years, I'd defined myself through my relationships with others. First as Marcus's wife, then as Victoria, Thomas, and Rebecca's mother. I'd poured my entire identity into caring for them, supporting them, making their lives easier and more comfortable. And they'd just told me they didn't need me anymore. When I returned to the sunroom, my children were engaged in quiet conversation that stopped abruptly when I appeared. They looked at me with a mixture of concern and wariness, as if I might break down or cause a scene. Instead, I began clearing the table with the same efficiency I'd always employed when hosting gatherings. Mom, you don't have to clean up now, Thomas said, reaching for my arm. We can help. That's very kind of you, sweetheart, but I've got it handled. I smiled at him, the same warm smile I'd given him when he was 5 years old, and offered to help with dishes by standing on a step stool. After all, I need to learn to do things on my own, don't I? Victoria stood up, smoothing her skirt and checking her expensive watch. We should probably head out anyway. I have some briefs to review before tomorrow. Of course you do. And Thomas, don't you have that meeting with the producer you mentioned? My son's face flushed slightly. We both knew there was no producer. Just as we both knew there probably never would be. But I'd played along with his fantasies for so long that calling them out now would have been cruel. Yeah, actually, I should get going too. Rebecca was already gathering her oversized purse and the silk scarf I'd bought her in Paris last spring. This was really good, Mom. I mean, the conversation. It needed to happen. They each hugged me goodbye, the same perfunctory embraces they'd given me at the beginning of the morning. I stood in my doorway and watched them drive away in their expensive cars, funded by the woman they'd just declared they didn't need. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, surrounded by the silence that had become my constant companion since Marcus's death. The house felt different somehow, as if my children's words had shifted something fundamental in its foundation. I looked around at the family photos, the expensive furniture, the artwork I'd collected over decades of marriage and motherhood, and realized that none of it meant anything without people to share it with. At 3 o'clock, I did something I hadn't done in years. I got dressed in my nicest outfit, grabbed my purse, and drove downtown to Henderson and Associates, the law firm that had been managing my family's legal affairs since Marcus passed away. Samuel Henderson was a distinguished man in his 70s who had been handling wealthy families' estates for decades. His office overlooked the city's financial district, and his mahogany desk was covered with the kind of leather-bound legal documents that represented millions of dollars in assets and careful planning. "Elena," he said, rising to greet me with genuine warmth. "What a pleasant surprise. I hope everything is well with you and the children." "Actually, Samuel, that's what I wanted to discuss with you. I need to make some changes to my will." His eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "Of course. What kind of changes did you have in mind?" I settled into the plush chair across from his desk and opened my purse, pulling out a small notebook where I'd been jotting down thoughts during the drive over. "I want to revoke the current will entirely and create a new one. My children have made it clear that they're adults who don't need my involvement in their lives, so I think it's time I started living accordingly." Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reading people. "Elena, forgive me for asking, but did something happen today? This seems like a significant departure from your previous wishes." I thought about how to explain the morning's conversation without sounding petty or vindictive. My children informed me that they feel I've been too involved in their lives and that they need space to be independent adults. They've asked me to step back from our weekly family gatherings and limit our contact to monthly dinners. "I see," Samuel said carefully. "And this has prompted you to reconsider your estate planning?" "It's prompted me to reconsider a lot of things. Samuel, I've spent the last 5 years since Marcus died organizing my entire life around my children. I've supported them financially, emotionally, and practically, in every way imaginable. And today they told me I was being clingy and overbearing. I pulled out my reading glasses and consulted my notes. So I think it's time I took their advice and learned to live independently. Starting with my will." Samuel reached for a legal pad and picked up his gold fountain pen. "What specific changes would you like to make?" "First, I want to establish a trust for animal welfare organizations. I've always loved animals, and I think it's time I started supporting causes I'm passionate about rather than just funding my children's lifestyles." "That's a wonderful charitable focus. Any particular organizations you have in mind?" "The Denver Animal Shelter, the Wildlife Preservation Fund, and the Rescued Pets Network. I want to split 2/3 of my estate between those 3 organizations." Samuel's pen paused. 2/3? That's quite substantial. What about the remaining third? "I want to establish a scholarship fund for first-generation college students who are studying to become teachers or social workers. People who dedicate their lives to helping others, rather than just helping themselves. And your children? I met his eyes steadily. Since they've made it clear they don't need me, I assume they don't need my money either. They're all capable adults with their own careers and resources after all. Samuel set down his pen and folded his hands on the desk. Elena, I have to ask you to consider this decision carefully. Estate planning when you're emotionally upset can lead to regrets later. Perhaps you might want to take some time to think this through. Samuel, I've never been more clear-headed about anything in my life. My children have shown me exactly how they view our relationship, and I'm simply responding accordingly. If they want independence, then they should have it completely. What about specific bequests? Personal items? Sentimental pieces? I consulted my notes again. Victoria can have my jewelry collection. She's always admired it, and she has the lifestyle to wear it properly. Thomas can have Marcus's vintage record collection and his golf clubs. Rebecca can have all my art books and the painting supplies in her studio. Those seem like thoughtful personal gifts. They are. But everything else, the house, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies, the vacation properties, all of that goes to the charitable organizations and the scholarship fund. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, presumably calculating the magnitude of what I was proposing. My estate was worth approximately $12 million, accumulated over decades of careful saving and wise investments. Under my previous will, my children would have inherited equal shares of everything, making each of them wealthy beyond their current dreams. Elena, I feel obligated to point out that your children may not understand the financial implications of their request for independence. They may not realize that you've been planning to leave them a substantial inheritance. That's exactly the point, Samuel. They don't know because they've never asked. They've simply assumed that I would always be there, providing for them, supporting them, cleaning up their messes, and ensuring their comfort. Well, they've asked for independence, and true independence means standing on your own feet financially as well as emotionally. I closed my notebook and met his concerned gaze. I want you to draw up the papers this week. I'd like to sign the new will by Friday. Are you certain you don't want to discuss this with your children first? Give them a chance to understand the consequences of this morning's conversation. Samuel. My children are intelligent, successful adults. They made their decision with full knowledge of what they were asking for. I'm simply honoring their request in the most complete way possible. He sighed, but reached for his legal pad again. Very well, I'll have the Gambina documents prepared. But Elena, I strongly encourage you to consider including some provision for your children, even if it's less than your original plan. Complete disinheritance can create lasting family divisions. The division already exists, Samuel. I'm just acknowledging it legally. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook Heights, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. A sense of personal agency. For too long, I'd allowed my identity to be completely wrapped up in other people's needs and expectations. I'd been Marcus's wife, then his widow. I'd been Victoria, Thomas, and Rebecca's mother, and nothing more. But today, they'd unwittingly given me permission to rediscover who Elena Matthews might be when she wasn't defined entirely by her relationships to other people. That evening, I did something else I hadn't done in years. Instead of calling each of my children to check on their days, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine and simply enjoyed the sunset. I didn't worry about whether Thomas had eaten dinner or if Victoria was working too late, or if Rebecca was feeling inspired. I didn't plan next week's menu or think about what gifts to buy for upcoming birthdays. For the first time in decades, I just existed in my own life, and it felt surprisingly liberating. The week passed quietly. Usually my days were punctuated by phone calls from my children. Thomas calling to ask for advice about everything from his car making strange noises to whether he should join a gym. Rebecca wanting to discuss her latest artistic crisis, or asking if I could loan her money for new supplies. Victoria checking in with efficient, businesslike conversations that nonetheless made me feel connected to her demanding life. This week the phone remained silent. Apparently their declaration of independence was being taken seriously by all parties. I spent the time rediscovering interests I'd abandoned years ago. I visited the art museum downtown, something I'd always meant to do but never found time for. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center. I bought books about wildlife photography, inspired by the idea of traveling to photograph animals for the organizations that would soon benefit from my estate. On Thursday, I called my friend Margaret, whom I'd barely spoken to in months. "Elena," she exclaimed, clearly surprised to hear from me. "How lovely to hear your voice. I was just thinking about you the other day. How are Victoria and the twins doing?" "Actually, Margaret, I was calling to ask if you'd like to have dinner tomorrow night. Just the two of us. It's been far too long since we've had a proper conversation." "I'd love that. But don't you have your usual Sunday brunch to prepare for?" "Not this week. My children have asked for some space to be more independent." Margaret paused, and I could hear the curiosity in her silence. "Well then, Friday dinner it is. My treat." On Friday afternoon, I returned to Samuel's office to sign the new will. The documents were thick and official-looking, filled with legal language that formalized my decision to redirect my life's accumulated wealth toward causes I believed in, rather than children who'd made it clear they didn't need me. "Last chance to reconsider," Samuel said gently as he laid the papers before me. "I've never been more certain of anything." I signed my name with a flourish, and Samuel had his secretary notarize the documents. Just like that, with a few strokes of a pen, I had transformed from a woman whose entire legacy was wrapped up in her children's comfort to someone whose death would benefit hundreds of animals and dozens of future teachers and social workers. "There is one more thing," Samuel said as I gathered my purse. "Have you considered how you want to inform your children about this change?" "I haven't decided yet. Part of me thinks they don't need to know unless something happens to me. After all, they've made it clear that my financial situation isn't their concern. Elena, I understand you're hurt, but I strongly advise against keeping this secret indefinitely. If they find out about the will change after your death, it could create significant legal challenges and family trauma. I considered this. What do you suggest? Perhaps in a few months, when emotions have settled, you might consider having a conversation with them about your decision. Give them an opportunity to understand the connection between their request for independence and your estate planning choices. I'll think about it." That evening, Margaret and I had dinner at Chez Laurent, the French restaurant where Marcus and I used to celebrate anniversaries. Over excellent wine and coq au vin, I found myself talking about my children's ultimatum and my subsequent decision. "My goodness, Elena," Margaret said, setting down her wine glass. "You've completely disinherited them? I've given them exactly what they asked for, complete independence from their overbearing mother. But surely they didn't mean financially?" I cut a piece of chicken with more force than necessary. "Margaret, my children are 34, 31, and 28 years old. Victoria makes more money than I ever did. Thomas has a trust fund from his father that he's never even touched because I've been subsidizing his lifestyle. Rebecca has enough talent and education to support herself if she chose to focus on commercial work instead of abstract art. But Elena, you've been supporting them for years. They've probably built their lives around that support." "Exactly. And today they told me that support was unwelcome interference, so I'm giving them the opportunity to build lives that don't depend on their overbearing mother's money." Margaret was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in her glass. "Do you think they really understood what they were asking for?" "I think they understood perfectly. They're highly intelligent people who made a deliberate choice to prioritize their independence over their relationship with me. I'm simply respecting that choice." "What will you do with your time now, without the weekly brunches and constant contact?" For the first time in the conversation, I smiled genuinely. "I'm going to live my own life, Margaret. I'm thinking of traveling, maybe taking that photography course I always wanted to try. I've joined a pottery class, and I'm considering volunteering at the animal shelter." "That sounds wonderful, actually. I've always thought you gave too much of yourself to those children." "Well, that's finished now. They don't want my involvement, so they won't have it." As we walked to our cars after dinner, Margaret caught my arm. "Elena, I hope you know I support whatever decision makes you happy. But I also hope you'll keep the door open for reconciliation if your children realize they made a mistake. If they realize they made a mistake, they know where to find me." The weekend passed peacefully. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't spend Saturday shopping for special ingredients and Sunday morning cooking an elaborate brunch. Instead, I slept in, read a novel in my garden, and took a long walk through the neighborhood I'd lived in for decades but had never really explored on foot. On Sunday afternoon, my phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I hesitated. Then I answered with the same pleasant tone I'd use for any acquaintance. "Hello, Victoria. Mom, I was calling to check on you. We didn't hear from you this week, which is unusual. I've been quite busy, actually. I took your advice about learning to live independently." "That's great, Mom. I'm glad to hear it. So, what are your plans for next Sunday? Should we plan on brunch?" I paused, genuinely surprised. "I thought you wanted to scale back to monthly dinners?" "Well, yes, but I thought we might do one more brunch before we make that transition. I'm afraid I've already made other plans for next Sunday, but we can certainly schedule a monthly dinner. How does the first Saturday of next month sound?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Oh, okay, that sounds fine. Are you feeling all right, Mom? You sound different." "I feel wonderful, sweetheart. Better than I have in years, actually." After we hung up, I realized that I really did feel wonderful. The constant low-level anxiety about my children's well-being, their happiness, their needs, had lifted like fog burning off in morning sunlight. If they needed me, they would call. If they didn't, I was free to focus on my own interests and happiness. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into my new life with an enthusiasm that surprised me. The pottery class was more challenging than I'd expected, but I loved working with my hands to create something beautiful and functional. The photography course opened up a world of technical knowledge I'd never explored, and I found myself planning a trip to Yellowstone to photograph wildlife. I volunteered twice a week at the Denver Animal Shelter, helping with everything from walking dogs to assisting with adoption events. The staff was amazed by my dedication and quickly made me feel like an essential part of their team. "Elena, you're a godsend," said Janet, the shelter director, after I'd organized their entire filing system and implemented a new tracking system for medical records. "I don't know how we managed without you." It had been years since anyone had made me feel truly needed and appreciated for my specific skills and contributions. My social life expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. Through the pottery class, I met Linda, a retired teacher who shared my interest in travel photography. Through the animal shelter, I connected with Robert, a widowed veterinarian who volunteered his services and had a wonderful sense of humor. Through the photography course, I met an entire group of people my age who were passionate about exploring creative pursuits they'd postponed during their career years. For the first time in decades, my calendar was full of activities I'd chosen because they interested me, not because they served someone else's needs. My children called occasionally, but the conversations were brief and somewhat stilted. They seemed unsure how to relate to this new version of their mother, who wasn't constantly asking about their lives or offering unsolicited help and advice. Thomas called one evening in October, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. "Mom, are you okay? Rebecca said she tried to call you last weekend, but you were out of town." I was in Estes Park, taking photographs for a wildlife conservation project. It was absolutely beautiful. "That sounds nice. But Mom, I wanted to ask you about something. My rent is due tomorrow and I'm a little short this month. Could you transfer some money to my account?" For years, I'd been automatically transferring money to Thomas whenever he needed it, which was most months. He'd never developed the habit of budgeting carefully because he knew I would always cover any shortfalls. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I think that would be inappropriate given our new relationship dynamic." "What do you mean? You asked for independence from my involvement in your life. Managing your finances would certainly qualify as involvement, wouldn't it?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, I just meant the emotional stuff. The checking up on us constantly, the unsolicited advice. I didn't mean you should stop helping us when we actually need it." "But Thomas, don't you see how those things are connected? You can't have emotional independence while maintaining financial dependence. That's not how adult relationships work." "But Mom, I'm going through a rough patch right now. I just need a little help to get back on my feet." "You've been going through a rough patch for 8 years, sweetheart. Perhaps it's time to consider that the rough patch is actually your life, and you need to learn to navigate it without constant rescue from me." "That's pretty harsh, Mom." "It's not harsh, Thomas. It's honest. You asked me to treat you like an adult, so I'm treating you like an adult. Adults handle their own financial responsibilities. So you're just gonna let me get evicted? I'm going to let you figure out how to solve your own problems, which is what you asked me to do. After we hung up, I felt a pang of guilt that quickly transformed into something else: pride. For the first time in years, I'd refused to enable Thomas's irresponsible behavior. I'd treated him like the capable adult he claimed to want to be. 3 days later, he called back to tell me he'd found a part-time job bartending and had worked out a payment plan with his landlord. He sounded surprised by his own capability to solve the problem without my intervention. Rebecca had a similar experience in November when she called asking me to pay for an expensive art workshop in Santa Fe. Mom, this could really be the breakthrough I need. The instructor is nationally recognized, and the networking opportunities alone could launch my career. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. I'm sure it will be worth the investment. So you'll pay for it? No, but I'm sure you'll figure out how to finance it if it's truly important to your career. Mom, I can't afford $3,000 for a workshop. Then perhaps you could look for more affordable educational opportunities. Or take on some commercial work to earn the money. Commercial work isn't real art, Mom, you know that. Actually, Rebecca, I don't know that. Some of the most beautiful and meaningful art in history was commissioned work. And many successful artists support their creative pursuits by doing commercial projects that pay the bills. I can't believe you're being so unsupportive. I'm being supportive in a new way. I'm supporting your development as an independent adult who can make her own financial decisions and live with the consequences. Rebecca hung up on me, but a week later she called back to tell me she'd gotten a job designing graphics for a local marketing firm and was saving money for the workshop. I actually like the commercial work more than I thought I would, she admitted. It's challenging in a different way, and my colleagues appreciate my artistic background. Victoria was the most resistant to the new dynamic. As the oldest and most successful, she'd always seen herself as my peer rather than my dependent. But even she had grown accustomed to the subtle ways I'd made her life easier over the years. In December, she called about Christmas plans. Mom, I assume you'll be hosting Christmas dinner as usual? David's parents are coming to town, and I've already told them about your famous prime rib. Actually, Victoria, I've made other plans for Christmas this year. Other plans? What kind of other plans? Linda and I are taking a photography tour of Costa Rica. We'll be documenting wildlife for a conservation organization. But Mom, it's Christmas. We always spend Christmas together. We spent Christmas together when you wanted to spend Christmas together. This year, you've all made it clear that you prefer independence from family obligations. That's not what we meant, and you know it. I'm not sure I do know what you meant, Victoria. You asked for space from my involvement in your lives. Christmas dinner certainly qualifies as involvement. Mom, this is ridiculous. You're punishing us for asking for reasonable boundaries. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm living my own life according to my own preferences, exactly as you suggested I should do. Victoria's voice took on the sharp edge she used in court. Fine. If you want to be petty and dramatic, that's your choice. But don't expect us to keep reaching out if you're going to respond with this passive-aggressive behavior. Victoria, I'm not being passive-aggressive. I'm being actively independent. There's a difference. After we hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the Christmas tree I'd put up for myself, decorated with new ornaments I'd chosen because I liked them, not because they held sentimental family value. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to Christmas as an adventure, rather than a stressful obligation to create the perfect family memory. Costa Rica was magical. Linda and I spent 2 weeks photographing exotic birds, playful monkeys, and colorful lizards in their natural habitat. Our photographs would be used in fundraising materials for the conservation organization, giving our hobby a sense of purpose that felt deeply satisfying. Elena, I have to tell you, Linda said as we sat on our hotel balcony watching the sunset over the rainforest, you've changed dramatically since I met you 6 months ago. You seem so much more alive and purposeful. I feel more alive. It's amazing how much energy you have when you stop pouring it all into people who don't want it. Do you miss your children? I considered the question honestly. I miss who I thought they were. I miss the relationship I thought we had. But I don't miss the constant worry, the feeling that I had to justify my existence by being useful to them. Do you think they'll come around? I don't know. And for the first time in my life, I'm okay with not knowing. If they decide they want a genuine relationship with me, I'm here. If they don't, I have a full and meaningful life without them. When I returned from Costa Rica, I found 17 voicemails on my phone. 3 were from friends welcoming me home. 14 were from my children, and their tone evolved from concerned to frustrated to angry as the days of my absence stretched on without explanation. I listened to them all, then deleted them without returning the calls. 2 days later, Victoria appeared at my front door. "Mom, we need to talk." She looked different somehow, less polished, more uncertain. Her usual armor of professional confidence seemed to have developed cracks. "Of course, sweetheart, come in." We sat in my living room, and I noticed she was looking around as if seeing the space for the first time. I'd redecorated in my absence, choosing colors and furniture that pleased me, rather than maintaining the family-friendly neutrals I'd favored when the house was constantly full of children and grandchildren. "The house looks different," she said. I redecorated. I decided it was time to make the space reflect my own tastes rather than trying to please everyone else. "Mom, I owe you an apology." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. Victoria rarely apologized for anything. "Thomas and Rebecca and I have been talking, and we realized that we may have been unclear about what we were asking for in October. I thought you were quite clear, actually. We wanted you to stop worrying about us so much, stop trying to solve our problems before we even knew we had them. We wanted you to treat us like independent adults, but we didn't mean you should withdraw all your support and affection." I studied my eldest daughter's face, noting the subtle signs of stress I'd learned to read over 34 years of motherhood. Dark circles under her eyes, tension around her mouth, the way she kept fidgeting with her wedding ring. "Victoria, help me understand something. You told me I was being clingy and overbearing. You said it was time I learned to live my own life. You asked me to step back from our weekly gatherings. How is what I've been doing any different from what you requested?" She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Because you've taken it to extremes, Mom. We asked for breathing room, not complete abandonment." "Abandonment? I've answered every phone call from you, Thomas and Rebecca. I've been polite and loving in every conversation. I simply haven't been initiating contact or offering unsolicited help. Isn't that exactly what you wanted? But you're not acting like yourself. You're different." Cold. The words stung, but I kept my voice level. "I'm not cold, Victoria. I'm independent. I'm living my own life, pursuing my own interests, making my own choices about how to spend my time and energy. Apparently, the version of me that you were comfortable with was the one who existed solely to serve your needs." Victoria's composure finally cracked. "That's not fair. We love you, Mom. We've always loved you. I believe you do love me, but you love the version of me that was always available, always supportive, always ready to solve your problems or subsidize your choices. You don't seem very comfortable with the version of me that has her own life and priorities." "Thomas got evicted from his apartment last month," she said suddenly. "Did you know that?" My heart clenched, but I forced myself to remain calm. "No, I didn't know. I'm sorry to hear he's going through difficulties. He's been sleeping on friends' couches. He's embarrassed to ask for help because he thinks you'll lecture him about responsibility. Thomas is a 31-year-old man, Victoria. If he needs help, he can ask for it directly. I'm not going to chase after him trying to solve problems he hasn't told me about. But that's what mothers do. They help their children when they're struggling. No, that's what I used to do. But you all made it very clear that my help was unwelcome interference. You can't ask me to stop being involved in your lives and then criticize me for not being involved enough when things go wrong." Victoria stood up and began pacing, her lawyer instincts kicking in as she tried to find an angle that would win the argument. "Mom, I think we need to be honest here. You're punishing us because your feelings were hurt. You're withholding support to teach us a lesson." "I'm not withholding anything, Victoria. I'm simply not offering things that haven't been requested." There's a significant difference. So if Thomas came to you tomorrow and asked for help finding a new apartment, you'd help him. I considered the question carefully. I would listen to him, offer emotional support, and perhaps suggest resources. But I wouldn't write him a check or spend my weekend apartment hunting for him. That would be treating him like a child rather than the independent adult he asked me to see him as. That's not the mother you used to be. No, it's not. The mother I used to be was constantly anxious about your well-being, constantly trying to anticipate your needs, constantly feeling responsible for your happiness. That mother was exhausted, underappreciated, and apparently overbearing. This mother is rested, fulfilled, and focused on her own growth and contribution to the world. Victoria stopped pacing and stared at me. You really have changed. Yes, I have. Your request for independence gave me permission to rediscover who I am when I'm not defined entirely by my role as your mother. And who is that? I smiled, and for the first time in months it felt completely genuine. She's someone who photographs wildlife for conservation organizations, someone who creates beautiful pottery with her own hands, someone who volunteers at animal shelters and makes a real difference in the lives of abandoned pets. Someone who travels to exotic places and forms friendships based on shared interests rather than family obligation. Someone who doesn't need us anymore. The pain in Victoria's voice was unmistakable, and I felt my resolve waver slightly. Then I reminded myself of the conversation that had started this entire journey. Victoria, I will always love you and your siblings more than my own life. But no, I don't need you anymore. Not in the desperate, identity-defining way I used to. And that's healthier for all of us. She was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Rebecca thinks you hate us now. I could never hate you, but I also can't go back to the relationship we had before. It wasn't sustainable for me, and apparently, it wasn't comfortable for you either. What if we wanted to try again? What if we acknowledged that we made a mistake in how we handled things in October? What exactly would be different? Victoria sat back down, leaning forward with the intensity she brought to important negotiations. We could go back to the Sunday brunches, but maybe make them less formal, more like friends getting together than me and Thomas and Rebecca reporting to Mom about our lives. And what about the financial support you've all become accustomed to? She shifted uncomfortably. I don't need financial support, Mom. My law practice is very successful. That wasn't my question. Thomas and Rebecca might need help occasionally, but it would be genuine emergencies, not lifestyle subsidies. I nodded thoughtfully. And what about my own life? My photography, my pottery classes, my volunteer work, my travel plans? We want you to be happy, Mom. If those things make you happy, then we support them completely. Even if they sometimes conflict with family plans? Even if I'm not always available when you want to talk or get together? Victoria hesitated, and in that hesitation I heard the truth. They wanted me to be happy, but only in ways that didn't inconvenience them. They wanted me to have interests and activities, but they still expected me to prioritize their needs when conflicts arose. I need to think about this, Victoria. This conversation has been helpful, but I can't make any decisions about changing our relationship dynamic without careful consideration. How long do you need to think? So as long as it takes. I've learned not to make important decisions under pressure or out of guilt. After Victoria left, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, surrounded by the winter flowers I'd planted in November, hardy pansies and snapdragons that could survive the Colorado cold, just like I was learning to survive the emotional cold of my children's rejection and subsequent attempts at reconciliation. My phone rang and Thomas's name appeared on the screen. Hi, sweetheart. Mom, Victoria said she talked to you today. His voice sounded rough, tired. She did. She mentioned you'd been having some housing difficulties. Yeah, it's been rough. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course. Do you hate me for what we said to you in October? The question broke my heart. Thomas, I could never hate you. You're my son, and I love you unconditionally. But you've been so distant. So different. Rebecca thinks you're punishing us. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm protecting myself. From what? I closed my eyes, trying to find the right words. From the pain of constantly investing my emotional energy in people who made it clear they didn't want that investment. From the exhaustion of trying to anticipate and meet needs that you all said you could handle yourselves. From the heartbreak of being told that my love felt like interference. We never said we didn't want your love, Mom. Thomas, love isn't just a feeling. It's actions, attention, care, involvement. You can't separate them and still have a meaningful relationship. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, he said quietly. About how you used to always know when I was struggling, before I even knew it myself. How you'd call at exactly the right moment or show up with exactly what I needed. And how did that feel to you? Honestly, sometimes it felt suffocating. Like I couldn't even have private emotions without you sensing them and trying to fix them. So you asked me to stop. Yeah, but I didn't realize that meant you'd stop caring whether I was okay or not. I haven't stopped caring, Thomas. I've stopped taking responsibility for your well-being. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long moment. Can I ask you something else? Of course. Are you happier now, without us constantly needing things from you? I considered his question carefully. I'm more at peace. I'm less anxious. I'm more fulfilled by my own activities and relationships. Whether that equals happiness? I'm not sure yet. But I know I'm healthier. I'm proud of you, Mom. The words were so unexpected that I felt tears spring to my eyes. What? I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. For refusing to let us treat you like our personal problem solver. For building a life that doesn't revolve around us. Thomas. I got a job, Mom. A real job, not just bartending shifts. I'm working for a small marketing firm, writing copy for their clients. It turns out I'm actually good at commercial writing, even if it's not the great American novel I always talked about. That's wonderful, sweetheart. How does it feel? Scary. But good scary. Like I'm finally becoming the person I always could have been if I hadn't been so comfortable being rescued all the time. We talked for another hour, and for the first time since October, it felt like a conversation between two adults, rather than a mother managing her child's emotional state. Over the following weeks, I received similar calls from Rebecca. She'd been offered a full-time position at the marketing firm, where she'd been working part-time, and her artwork was being featured in a group show at a downtown gallery. Mom, I wanted to invite you to the opening, she said during one of our conversations, but I understand if you're too busy with your photography and volunteer work. I would love to come to your opening, Rebecca. I'm very proud of what you've accomplished. Really? Even though it's mostly commercial work, not the pure art I used to talk about? Sweetheart, supporting yourself through your creative talents is one of the most admirable things an artist can do. You're using your gifts to contribute to the world while building a sustainable life. That takes courage and maturity. The gallery opening was a revelation. Rebecca's work was displayed beautifully, and she moved through the crowd with a confidence I hadn't seen in years. She introduced me to her colleagues and new friends, people who knew her as a talented professional rather than someone's financially dependent daughter. Your mother raised a remarkable young woman, one of her clients told me. Rebecca's designs have transformed our entire brand identity. Watching my youngest daughter shine in her own accomplishments, surrounded by people who valued her for her skills and contributions, I felt a pride that was deeper and more satisfying than anything I'd experienced during her years of financial dependence. As winter melted into spring, my relationship with my children evolved into something entirely new. We spoke regularly, but the conversations were between equals rather than a service provider and demanding clients. They shared their successes and struggles, but they didn't expect me to solve their problems or finance their mistakes. Thomas found his own apartment, one he could afford on his new salary. Rebecca started dating a fellow artist she'd met at a gallery opening, someone who encouraged her professional ambitions rather than enabling her dependence. Victoria began taking pottery classes herself, inspired by my enthusiasm for the medium. In April, Samuel Henderson called with an update on my estate planning. Elena, I wanted to check in with you about your will. It's been 6 months since you made those changes, and I wondered if you'd given any more thought to including some provisions for your children. Actually, Samuel, I have been thinking about that. I've been watching how they've responded to my withdrawal of financial support, and I'm impressed by their resilience and growth. So you're considering revising the will again? I'm considering it. They've shown me that they're capable of independence when they're required to be. They've built meaningful lives and careers without relying on my constant intervention. That's wonderful to hear. What kind of provisions were you thinking about? I looked out my office window at the garden where I'd planted new flowers, different varieties than I'd chosen when I was trying to please everyone else's tastes. I think I'd like to establish modest trust funds for each of them. Not enough to make them wealthy, but enough to provide security if they face genuine emergencies or want to pursue opportunities that align with their talents. That sounds like a thoughtful compromise. The majority of my estate would still go to the charitable organizations and scholarship fund. But I think my children have earned the right to benefit from their family inheritance, now that they've proven they don't need it to live meaningful lives. What changed your mind? They stopped asking for my money and started asking for my opinion. They stopped demanding my services and started appreciating my wisdom. They stopped seeing me as a resource to be exploited and started seeing me as a person to be valued. In May, I invited all 3 of my children to Sunday brunch for the first time since October. The invitation was casual, offering them an easy way to decline if they weren't interested. They all accepted. The morning felt different from those distant Sunday gatherings of the previous year. Instead of elaborate preparations designed to impress them, I made simple foods I enjoyed eating. Instead of anxiously anticipating their arrival, I looked forward to their company the same way I looked forward to seeing my friend Linda or my pottery classmates. Victoria arrived first, carrying a bouquet of flowers from her own garden. "I brought these for the table," she said. "I remembered how much you love fresh flowers with brunch." Thomas came bearing homemade scones he'd learned to make in a cooking class he'd taken with his new girlfriend. "I thought you might enjoy trying something I made for you instead of the other way around," he said with a grin. Rebecca brought a small painting she'd created of the garden behind my house, painted from memory during one of her commercial breaks at work. "I wanted to capture how beautiful this place looks in spring," she said. "It's where I learned to love beauty." As we sat around the table, our conversation flowed easily between topics that interested all of us. Victoria talked about a pro bono case she'd taken involving animal rights, inspired by my volunteer work at the shelter. Thomas described the satisfaction he'd found in writing marketing copy for small businesses, helping them tell their stories effectively. Rebecca shared her excitement about a commission she'd received to create artwork for a new children's hospital. "Mom," Victoria said during a lull in conversation, "I owe you an apology that I didn't fully give you in January." "Oh? We thought we were asking you to give us space to be adults, but what we were really asking was for you to continue supporting us like children while treating us like adults. That was unfair and impossible." Thomas nodded. "We wanted all the benefits of being your children without any of the responsibilities of being your family." Rebecca reached across the table and took my hand. "We were selfish, Mom. We took advantage of your generosity and then complained when you had expectations that came with that generosity." I looked at each of their faces, seeing maturity and self-awareness that hadn't been there 8 months ago. "I appreciate your apologies, and I accept them. But I also want you to know that your request for independence was one of the greatest gifts you ever gave me." They looked confused, so I continued. "For 34 years, I defined myself entirely through my role as your mother. I had no interests that weren't connected to your needs, no relationships that weren't filtered through my identity as Marcus's wife and your mother. When you told me you didn't need that level of involvement from me, it forced me to discover who Elena Matthews is when she's not taking care of other people." "And who is she?" Thomas asked. I smiled. "She's someone who finds deep satisfaction in helping abandoned animals find homes. She's someone who can create beautiful things with her own hands. She's someone who can capture the essence of wild creatures through photography. She's someone who enjoys traveling with friends and learning new skills and contributing to causes she believes in. Someone who's happy," Rebecca added softly. "Someone who's complete. I love you 3 more than life itself, but I no longer need you to validate my existence. That makes me a better mother and a better person." Victoria was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at me. "Mom, would you be willing to go back to weekly brunches?" Not the elaborate productions you used to create, but simple gatherings where we can stay connected as a family? I'd love that, as long as you understand that some Sundays I might have other commitments. My life is fuller now than it used to be. We understand, Thomas said. And we want to hear about those commitments. We want to know about your photography and your pottery and your volunteer work. We want to know who our mother is, not just what she can do for us, Rebecca added. That afternoon, after my children had left, I called Samuel Henderson. Samuel, I'd like to schedule a meeting to revise my will again. Of course, Elena. Have you decided how you'd like to modify the charitable bequests? I want to reduce them slightly to include trust funds for my children. Not massive inheritances, but enough to provide them with security and opportunities. They've shown me they can stand on their own feet, which means they've earned the right to benefit from the family wealth they no longer depend on. That sounds like wise estate planning. What prompted the change? I looked around my living room, decorated now according to my own tastes, filled with photographs I'd taken and pottery I'd created and books about subjects that interested me personally. They stopped needing me and started choosing me. There's a difference, and it makes all the difference. That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set behind the mountains, surrounded by flowers I'd planted because I loved them, rather than because they impressed visitors. My phone buzzed with text messages from each of my children, thanking me for a wonderful day and telling me about their week ahead. For the first time in years, I felt truly content. Not the anxious satisfaction of being needed, but the peaceful fulfillment of being valued. Not the exhausting happiness of constantly serving others, but the sustainable joy of living authentically while maintaining meaningful relationships. My children had asked me to let them grow up, and in doing so, they'd allowed me to grow up too. We'd all learned the difference between love that enables and love that empowers, between family bonds that constrain and family bonds that support. The woman who had signed those first divorce papers in Samuel's office 9 months ago had been defeated, diminished, and defined entirely by other people's needs. The woman who would sign the revised will next week was someone who knew her own worth, pursued her own interests, and chose her relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need. My children had given me the greatest gift possible when they told me they didn't need me anymore. They'd given me permission to discover that I didn't need them either, which paradoxically made it possible for us to genuinely want each other. Love, I had learned, was not about being indispensable. It was about being irreplaceable by choice rather than necessity. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, I began planning my next photography expedition. This time, I would be documenting the migration patterns of Arctic birds, a 3-week journey to Alaska that would contribute to important climate change research. A year ago, such a trip would have been impossible because I would have been too worried about my children's needs to leave them for 3 weeks. Now I knew they would not only survive without me, but would probably have exciting stories to share when I returned. The transformation was complete. I was no longer Elena the mother, Elena the caretaker, Elena the problem solver. I was simply Elena, a woman with her own dreams, her own contributions to make, and her own life to live. And for the first time in decades, that was more than enough. 2 years had passed since my children declared their independence, and the woman who sat across from Samuel Henderson's mahogany desk bore little resemblance to the defeated mother who had first walked into his office in October, seeking revenge through disinheritance. The woman facing him now had sun-streaked silver hair from months spent photographing wildlife in remote locations, calloused hands from hours at the pottery wheel, and the confident posture of someone who had learned to value her own worth. "Elena, you look radiant," Samuel said as he spread the latest version of my will across his desk. "Alaska clearly agreed with you." I smiled, thinking of the 3 weeks I'd spent documenting Arctic terns and snowy owls in temperatures that would have terrified the old me. It was transformative. The photographs are being used in a major climate change awareness campaign. National Geographic might even publish a feature article. That's remarkable. And how are things with your children? Better than I ever could have imagined. We found our rhythm as adults who choose to be in each other's lives, rather than people bound together by obligation and dependence. Samuel nodded approvingly as he reviewed the documents. This latest revision strikes me as the perfect balance. Charitable giving that reflects your passions, provisions for your children that acknowledge their growth, and personal bequests that honor the relationships you've built in your new life. The will now allocated 40% of my estate to wildlife conservation organizations, 30% to educational scholarships for first-generation college students, 20% to trust funds for my 3 children, and 10% to friends and causes that had become meaningful during my journey of self-discovery. It was a document that reflected the fullness of who I had become, rather than the narrow identity I had once inhabited. There is one unusual element I wanted to discuss with you, Samuel continued, pulling out a separate document. This letter you've asked me to include with the will. Are you certain you want to attach such a personal message to a legal document? I looked at the handwritten pages I'd crafted over several weeks, choosing each word carefully. The letter explained my journey from desperate mother to independent woman, from someone who gave love as transaction to someone who offered it as gift. It detailed the lessons I'd learned about the difference between enabling and empowering, between being needed and being valued. Samuel, my children and I went through a transformation together. If something happens to me, I want them to understand not just what I'm leaving them, but why. I want them to know that their inheritance reflects their growth, not just my affection. It's beautifully written, Elena. Very personal and heartfelt. They earned those words, every single one of them. After signing the final documents, I drove to the Denver Animal Shelter, where I was scheduled to lead a volunteer orientation for new helpers. Over the past 2 years, I'd become something of a legend there, the woman who had transformed their filing systems, organized their most successful fundraising events, and personally helped place over 300 animals in loving homes. Elena, perfect timing, called Janet as I entered the building. The new volunteers are gathering in the conference room, and I think they'd be inspired to hear your story. I laughed. Which story? The one about the woman who spent 60 years taking care of everyone except herself? Or the one about the woman who learned that helping others starts with helping yourself? Both, actually. You embody what it means to find purpose through service while maintaining personal boundaries. The conference room was filled with 20 new volunteers, ranging in age from college students to retirees like myself. As I looked around the room, I was struck by how much my perspective had changed. 2 years ago, I would have seen this group and immediately started cataloging their needs, figuring out how I could make their experience better, smoother, more comfortable. Now I saw them as fellow travelers, each bringing their own skills and motivations to meaningful work. Welcome to the Denver Animal Shelter family, I began. I know Janet asked me to share my story with you, but I'd rather start by hearing yours. What brought each of you here today? A young woman raised her hand. I just graduated from veterinary school, and I want to give back to the community while I'm building my practice. An older gentleman spoke next. My wife passed away 6 months ago, and our house feels too quiet. I thought helping animals might help fill that emptiness. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes added, My kids are grown and moved away, and I need something meaningful to do with my time now that I'm not constantly managing their schedules. I felt a familiar pang of recognition at her words. That's actually very similar to my story. 2 years ago, my 3 adult children told me they didn't need my constant involvement in their lives anymore. I was devastated at first, because I had no idea who I was when I wasn't taking care of someone else. The room was quiet, everyone leaning forward with interest. I thought my value as a person was entirely tied to my usefulness to my family. When they didn't need me anymore, I felt worthless. But it turned out they gave me the greatest gift possible. They forced me to discover what I was passionate about, what I could contribute to the world beyond my role as mother and wife. A young man in the back raised his hand. How did you figure out what you were passionate about? Trial and error, honestly. I tried pottery, photography, travel, volunteer work. Some things stuck, others didn't. The key was giving myself permission to explore, without having to justify how each activity served someone else's needs. I spent the next hour talking with the volunteers about the importance of sustainable service. How to help others without losing yourself in the process. How to set boundaries that protected your own well-being while still making a meaningful contribution. How to recognize when your desire to help was actually enabling someone else's dysfunction. After the orientation, I walked through the shelter kennels as I did every Tuesday and Friday. The barking and meowing that had once seemed overwhelming now felt like a familiar symphony. I stopped at the kennel of a senior golden retriever named Charlie, who had been returned twice by families who found his medical needs too demanding. "Hey there, handsome," I said, opening his kennel and settling onto the floor beside him. Charlie immediately rested his graying muzzle on my lap, his tail wagging slowly. "I know someone who might be perfect for you." 3 hours later, I was sitting in the living room of Robert Martinez, the widowed veterinarian I'd met through my volunteer work. Robert had become more than a colleague over the past 18 months. Our friendship had developed slowly, built on shared interests in animal welfare, travel, and the kind of deep conversations that come naturally when two people have lived long enough to know what matters. "Elena, are you seriously trying to convince me to adopt another dog?" Robert asked, laughing as Charlie immediately made himself comfortable on Robert's expensive leather sofa. "I already have Max and Luna." "Robert, look at him. He's a distinguished gentleman who needs a home with someone who appreciates his maturity and wisdom. Plus, he has some medical issues that most people can't handle, but you're a veterinarian." Robert scratched behind Charlie's ears, and the dog's tail wagged harder. "He is pretty magnificent, and those medical issues aren't really that serious, just expensive for most people." "Exactly. You could give him the kind of golden years he deserves." 2 hours later, Charlie was officially Robert's dog, and I was staying for dinner as we often did when our volunteer schedules aligned. Robert was an excellent cook, and our conversations over his homemade meals had become one of the highlights of my week. "You know," he said as we prepared salmon and asparagus together in his kitchen, "watching you work with those new volunteers today reminded me of something my late wife used to say." "What's that?" "She said that the people who make the best helpers are the ones who learn to help themselves first. They're not trying to heal their own wounds by rescuing others. They're sharing their strength from a place of wholeness." I paused in my chopping of vegetables, struck by the insight. That's exactly the difference between who I was 2 years ago and who I am now. I used to help people because I needed to feel needed. Now I help because I have something genuine to offer. It shows. You have this calm confidence that puts both animals and people at ease. You're not anxious about outcomes because you're not desperately trying to prove your worth through your service. We cooked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of easy companionship I'd never thought I'd find again after Marcus died. Robert and I weren't romantic partners, despite the well-meaning suggestions of mutual friends. We were something rarer and perhaps more valuable. Two whole people who enjoyed each other's company without need or expectation beyond friendship. "Robert, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever feel guilty for being happy? For building a life that doesn't revolve around grief for Patricia?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I did at first. It felt like betraying her memory to enjoy myself, to form new friendships, to find meaning in activities we'd never shared together." "What changed?" "I realized that Patricia would be heartbroken if I spent the rest of my life mourning instead of living. She loved me enough to want me to be happy, even without her, especially without her. My children would probably say the same thing about my journey toward independence. They love me enough to want me to have my own life, even though it was painful for all of us to reshape our relationship." "How are things with them now?" I smiled, thinking of the text message I'd received from Victoria that morning. She'd sent a photo of a pottery bowl she'd made in her own class, clearly proud of her crooked but heartfelt creation. "Better than ever. We've found this sweet spot where we're genuinely interested in each other's lives without being enmeshed in each other's problems. They call because they want to talk, not because they need something. I offer advice when they ask for it, but I don't try to solve their problems for them. That sounds like healthy adult relationships." It is, and it took all of us growing up for it to happen. Even me, at 64. The following evening was the monthly family dinner that had replaced our weekly brunches. This time, Thomas was hosting at his apartment, the first place he'd ever lived that was entirely funded by his own income. The space was small but comfortable, decorated with a mixture of thrift store finds and a few nice pieces he'd saved up to buy. I arrived to find Victoria already there, helping Thomas prepare a simple pasta dinner while Rebecca set the table with mismatched dishes that somehow looked intentionally eclectic rather than accidentally cheap. "Mom, perfect timing," Thomas called from the kitchen. "I'm about to drain the pasta, and Rebecca just opened a bottle of that wine you brought back from Italy." I looked around Thomas's living room, noting the framed photographs of his travels, the bookshelves filled with novels and writing guides, the small desk by the window where he worked on freelance projects in the evenings. It was the home of someone who was building a life rather than just occupying space. "Thomas, this place looks wonderful. You've really made it your own." He beamed with pride. "Thanks, Mom. It's not huge, but it's mine. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, I chose because I liked it, not because someone else paid for it." Victoria emerged from the kitchen carrying a salad bowl. "He's been so excited to host all of us. He spent the whole weekend cleaning and planning the menu." "It means a lot to me," Thomas said, his voice slightly emotional. "For years you did all the work of bringing us together, Mom. It feels good to be the one creating the gathering for once." As we sat around Thomas's small dining table, I was struck by how different this felt from those elaborate Sunday brunches I used to orchestrate. The food was simpler, the setting more modest, but the conversation was richer and more authentic than anything we'd shared in those earlier years. "Mom, tell us about the Arctic photography expedition," Rebecca said as she served herself pasta. "Your Instagram photos were incredible, but I want to hear the stories behind them." For the next hour, I regaled them with tales of sleeping in research stations, waiting for hours in below-freezing temperatures to capture the perfect shot, and working alongside scientists who were documenting climate change impacts on Arctic wildlife. "The most amazing thing was how quiet it was," I explained. "Complete silence except for the wind, and occasionally the calls of birds. It made me realize how much noise we live with constantly, both literally and figuratively." "Figuratively?" Victoria asked. "The noise of other people's expectations, of societal pressures, of our own internal dialogue about who we should be rather than who we are. In the Arctic, all of that fell away. There was just me, the camera, and the natural world." Thomas leaned forward with interest. "That sounds like what I've been discovering through writing. When I'm really in the flow of a project, all the external voices fade away and there's just the story trying to emerge." Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, exactly. That's what happens when I'm painting now. Not the struggle to create important art that I used to get caught up in, but just the pure joy of putting color and form together in ways that feel true." Victoria was quieter, but I could see her processing these ideas. "I think I understand what you're talking about, but I'm not sure I've experienced it yet. Law is so much about external validation, winning cases, impressing judges and clients. Have you found aspects of your legal work that give you that sense of pure engagement?" I asked. She considered the question. "Actually, yes. The pro bono cases I've been taking lately. Working with families who are trying to adopt rescue animals, or helping elderly people set up trusts to provide for their pets. There's something deeply satisfying about using my skills to help relationships between people and animals." "Maybe that's pointing you toward something," Rebecca suggested. "Maybe it is. I've been thinking about specializing in animal law. It's a growing field, and it combines my legal skills with something I actually care about beyond just winning." Thomas raised his wine glass. "To finding our authentic selves, even when it takes us 30 years to figure out who that is." We clinked glasses, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. These were not the dependent children who had dismissed me 2 years ago, nor were they the defensive young adults who had struggled with my withdrawal of support. These were 3 whole people who had discovered their own sources of meaning and were sharing their discoveries with family members they genuinely enjoyed. After dinner, we moved to Thomas's small balcony to watch the sunset over the city. The conversation meandered through topics that interested all of us: books we were reading, places we wanted to travel, projects we were excited about. At no point did anyone ask me to solve a problem, loan money, or provide emotional labor beyond normal familial support. "Mom, Rebecca said during a comfortable silence. I need to tell you something. My stomach clenched slightly, an old reflex from years of being the family's emotional emergency responder. I've been seeing someone. His name is David, and he's a teacher at an elementary school. We've been together for 6 months, and it's getting serious. I waited for the request for advice, approval, or assistance that would normally follow such an announcement. Instead, Rebecca continued with simple information sharing. He's wonderful, patient, creative, completely supportive of my art career without trying to manage it. We're talking about moving in together. That sounds lovely, sweetheart. I'd love to meet him sometime. Actually, I was hoping you'd all come to dinner at my place next weekend. I want you to meet him, but not in a way where you feel like you need to interview him or give your approval. Just as a family member, I care about meeting someone who's important to me. The distinction was subtle but significant. She wasn't asking me to evaluate her boyfriend or validate her choices. She was simply including me in her life because she valued my presence, not my judgment. I'd be honored to meet him, I said, and meant it. As the evening wound down and we prepared to leave, Victoria lingered behind while Thomas and Rebecca headed to their cars. Mom, can I walk you to your car? There's something I want to talk to you about privately. We strolled slowly through Thomas's neighborhood, past small houses with well-tended gardens and families visible through lit windows. I owe you an apology that's bigger than the one I gave you last year, Victoria began. Oh. I've been thinking a lot about those first years after Dad died, about how he handled your grief and your need for connection. I felt my chest tighten. The immediate aftermath of Marcus's death was still a painful period to revisit. Victoria, you don't need to apologize for how you responded to my grief. You were dealing with your own loss. No, Mom, I do need to apologize. Because we didn't just dismiss your emotional needs. We actively encouraged you to center your entire life around us as a way to avoid dealing with your loss. We stopped walking, and I turned to face my eldest daughter. What do you mean? Victoria's voice was thick with regret. We kept you so busy taking care of us, solving our problems, managing our lives, that you never had space to figure out who you were without Dad. We used your need to feel useful as a way to avoid the hard work of becoming truly independent adults. The insight was startling in its accuracy. In the chaos of my children's constant needs and crises, I had indeed avoided the deeper work of rebuilding my identity after losing my life partner. Victoria, you were young adults facing your own challenges. It's natural that you would turn to your surviving parent for support. Support, yes, but not total life management. We didn't just accept your help, Mom. We demanded it. We created crisis after crisis that required your intervention. We kept you so busy rescuing us that you never had time to rescue yourself. We began walking again, both of us processing this new understanding of our family dynamics. When we finally told you we needed independence, it wasn't really about you being overbearing, Victoria continued. It was about us finally realizing that we'd been using you as a crutch to avoid growing up. But instead of admitting that and working to change the dynamic together, we blamed you for being too involved. I was too involved, though. I enabled a lot of dysfunction because it made me feel needed. Yes, but we actively encouraged that enabling because it was easier than facing adult responsibilities. We made you complicit in our immaturity, then punished you for it. We had reached my car, but neither of us made a move to end the conversation. Victoria, why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to understand that your transformation over the past 2 years wasn't just about you learning to be independent. It was about all of us learning what healthy adult relationships actually look like. And I want to make sure you know that the problems in our family weren't your fault, even though we made you feel like they were. I leaned against my car, overwhelmed by the complexity of what she was saying. I think the truth is that we were all doing the best we could with the tools we had at the time. Your father's death changed everything for all of us, and we all coped in ways that ultimately weren't sustainable. But you're the one who did the work to change, Mom. When we asked for independence, you could have just pulled back emotionally and maintained the financial support. You could have stayed resentful and hurt. Instead, you used our rejection as an opportunity to build a completely new life. I had to. I was miserable living the way we were living. Exactly. And your willingness to change forced all of us to change too. If you'd kept enabling us, we'd probably still be acting like teenagers at 30-something. We hugged goodbye, and Victoria held on longer than usual. I love who you've become, Mom. I love who we've all become. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I reflected on Victoria's words. She was right that our family's dysfunction had been a collaborative effort, with each of us playing roles that felt necessary at the time but ultimately served no one well. But she was also right that someone had to break the cycle, and my children's demand for independence had given me the permission I needed to examine my own patterns. The house I returned to was no longer the shrine to family togetherness I'd maintained for years after Marcus's death. It was a home that reflected my own tastes, interests, and lifestyle. The photos on the walls included family pictures, but also images from my travels, shots of the pottery I'd created, pictures of the animals I'd helped place in homes. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my garden, surrounded by the flowers I'd planted for their beauty rather than their ability to impress visitors. Tomorrow I would fly to Costa Rica for another photography expedition, this time documenting efforts to protect sea turtle nesting beaches. Next month I had a pottery show where my work would be displayed alongside other local artists. In the spring, Robert and I were planning a trip to New Zealand to photograph birds unique to that region. My calendar was full of activities I'd chosen because they aligned with my interests and values, not because they served someone else's agenda. My phone contained contact information for friends I'd met through my volunteer work, my art classes, my travels. My bank account reflected spending on experiences and equipment that enhanced my own life rather than subsidizing other people's choices. At 64, I had finally learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between love that constrains and love that liberates. My children's Declaration of Independence had forced me to declare my own independence, and in doing so, we had all discovered what genuine interdependence could look like. The following week, I attended Rebecca's dinner party where I met David, her teacher boyfriend. He was exactly as she'd described, gentle, supportive, and clearly devoted to her without trying to control or manage her choices. Watching them together, I saw what a healthy adult relationship looked like when both people were whole individuals choosing to share their lives. Mrs. Matthews, Rebecca tells me you're a wildlife photographer, David said as we enjoyed the meal Rebecca had prepared entirely on her own, without calling me once for cooking advice. I am. It's been one of the most rewarding discoveries of my later years. That's inspiring. I keep telling my students that learning never stops, that they should stay curious their whole lives. You're a perfect example of that. Over dinner, David shared stories from his classroom, Rebecca talked about her latest commissioned pieces, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the company of these two young people who were building a life together based on shared values and mutual respect. As I drove home that night, I realized that this was what I'd been trying to create with my children all those years. Genuine connection based on choice rather than obligation. But it had taken all of us growing up, even me, to make that possible. 6 months later, I was sitting in Samuel Henderson's office once more, but this time the meeting had nothing to do with estate planning. Elena, I have to tell you, in 30 years of legal practice, I've never seen a family transformation quite like yours, Samuel said as he reviewed the documents spread across his desk. When you first walked into my office 2.5 years ago, you were talking about completely disinheriting your children out of hurt and anger. I was a different person then. So were they. And now you're here to establish a family foundation that will allow all of you to work together on causes you care about. I smiled, thinking about the proposal my children had brought to me the previous month. They wanted to create a charitable foundation focused on animal welfare, environmental conservation, and educational opportunities for underserved communities. They wanted to contribute their own money alongside mine, serve on the board together, and make it a multi-generational effort that could continue long after I was gone. They've become the kind of people I would choose to work with, even if they weren't my children, I said. They've developed their own expertise, their own passions, their own resources to contribute. This foundation isn't about me funding their pet projects. It's about us pooling our different strengths to make a bigger impact. Victoria's focus on animal law, Thomas's marketing and communication skills, Rebecca's artistic vision for fundraising materials. Samuel mused. It's a powerful combination. And my connections in the wildlife conservation world, my fundraising experience from the animal shelter, my photography skills for awareness campaigns. We each bring something unique to the table. Samuel leaned back in his chair, looking pleased. You know, Elena, this foundation structure means that your wealth will be working for causes you care about during your lifetime, not just after your death. That's a wonderful way to see your impact in action. It also means my children will learn to be philanthropists gradually, with guidance, rather than suddenly inheriting large sums they might not know how to handle responsibly. Very wise. And the individual trust funds you've maintained for them? Those are for their personal security and opportunities. The foundation work is separate from their inheritance. They're participating because they want to, not because they're expected to in order to receive their bequests. As I signed the final documents establishing the Matthews Family Foundation, I thought about how impossible this moment would have been 2.5 years ago. My children and I had been locked in patterns of resentment, dependency, and obligation that made genuine collaboration impossible. It had taken a complete breakdown of our old relationship for us to build something new and healthier. That evening we held the first official meeting of the foundation board in my dining room, the same space where I'd once served elaborate Sunday brunches designed to keep my children connected to me through obligation. Now we gathered around the same table as equals, each bringing our own expertise and resources to work we all genuinely cared about. I've been researching legal structures for animal rescue organizations, Victoria began, spreading papers across the table. There are some regulatory changes we could advocate for that would make it easier for shelters to transport animals across state lines for adoption. Thomas pulled out his laptop. I've been developing a social media strategy for raising awareness about wildlife conservation. The photography Mom's been doing would be perfect for visual storytelling campaigns. Rebecca opened a portfolio of design concepts. I've been working on branding ideas for the foundation, ways to visually communicate our mission that would appeal to different demographic groups. For the next 2 hours, we planned our first year of activities. Funding scholarships for students pursuing careers in veterinary medicine or environmental science, supporting small animal rescue operations, sponsoring wildlife photography expeditions that would contribute to scientific research. The conversation was energetic, focused, and completely collaborative. You know, Thomas said as we wrapped up the meeting, this feels like what family gatherings should have always been like. All of us contributing our best selves to something meaningful together. It took us all growing up to make this possible, Victoria added. If we'd tried to do this 3 years ago, it would have been Mom doing all the work while we took credit or complained about her methods. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. And Mom would have been so focused on making us happy that she wouldn't have insisted on approaches that actually worked effectively. I looked around the table at these 3 competent, passionate adults who shared my DNA, and now, finally, shared my values in action rather than just in theory. I'm proud of us, I said simply. Not just individually, but as a family. We figured out how to love each other without losing ourselves. 3 months later, I stood in front of a packed auditorium at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, delivering a keynote speech about wildlife conservation photography. The audience included professional photographers, conservation scientists, foundation donors, and members of the general public who cared about protecting endangered species. My children sat in the front row, beaming with pride as I shared images from my latest expedition to document monarch butterfly migration patterns. The photographs were being used by researchers to understand how climate change was affecting butterfly populations, and several had been selected for a traveling exhibition that would visit museums across the country. Conservation photography is about more than just taking beautiful pictures of animals, I explained to the audience. It's about creating visual evidence that inspires people to take action. Every photograph tells a story about the interconnectedness of all life on Earth. After the presentation, During the reception hosted by the Matthews Family Foundation, I was approached by a young woman who looked to be about Rebecca's age. Ms. Matthews, thank you for such an inspiring presentation. I'm Sarah Chen, and I just graduated with a degree in environmental science. Your photography work is what made me realize I wanted to focus on wildlife conservation. That's wonderful, Sarah. What specific area of conservation interests you most? Marine ecosystems, particularly coral reef restoration. I've been accepted to a graduate program, but I'm not sure I can afford it without taking on debt that might prevent me from working for nonprofit organizations after graduation. I smiled, thinking of the scholarship fund we'd just established. Sarah, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Victoria. She's handling scholarship applications for our foundation, and I think your interests might align perfectly with our mission. As Victoria and Sarah began talking about graduate school funding and career opportunities in conservation, I felt a satisfaction that was deeper and more lasting than anything I'd experienced during my years of enabling my children's dependence. This was what it looked like when people used their resources and capabilities in service of something larger than themselves. Thomas appeared at my elbow, carrying 2 glasses of wine. Mom, you were incredible up there. I've never seen you so confident and authoritative. It's easy to be confident when you're talking about something you're genuinely passionate about. The marketing firm I work for wants to propose doing pro bono work for the foundation's awareness campaigns. Would you be interested in that? I looked at my son, this man who had transformed from a financially dependent dreamer into someone who was actively contributing his professional skills to causes he cared about. Thomas, I think that would be wonderful, but I want you to make the proposal to the full board, not just to me. You've earned the right to have your ideas considered on their own merits. Rebecca joined our conversation, holding hands with David, whom she'd been dating for over a year now. Mom, David has been asking about volunteer opportunities with animal rescue organizations. I told him you'd be the perfect person to talk to about getting involved. David, I'd be happy to introduce you to the folks at the Denver Animal Shelter. They're always looking for volunteers, especially people with your patience and communication skills. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, my children helped me clean up the reception space. We worked together efficiently, each taking responsibility for different tasks, without need for coordination or direction from me. This was a perfect evening, Victoria said as she packed up leftover materials. Meaningful work, family collaboration, and genuine impact on issues we all care about. It's what I always hoped we could create together, I replied. I just had to learn that I couldn't force it to happen by trying to control everyone's choices. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. 3 years ago, I had been a woman whose entire identity was wrapped up in being needed by people who ultimately didn't want that level of involvement in their lives. My response to their rejection had been to withdraw completely, to rebuild my sense of self from scratch based on my own interests and capabilities, rather than my relationships to others. That process of self-discovery had been painful but necessary. I'd had to learn to sit with the discomfort of not being needed, to find other sources of validation and meaning, to develop friendships and interests that belonged entirely to me. Only after I'd become a complete person on my own terms could I return to my family relationships from a position of strength rather than neediness. My children had gone through their own parallel process of growth. Forced to handle their own problems without constant rescue from me, they developed resilience, competence, and genuine self-confidence. They'd learned to distinguish between support and enablement, between love that empowers and love that constrains. Now we were all whole people choosing to create something meaningful together, not dependent people using each other to avoid facing their own inadequacies. The house I returned to that night was quiet but not lonely. My calendar for the following month included a pottery exhibition opening, a volunteer shift at the animal shelter, a planning meeting for the foundation's next conservation project, and a photography workshop I was teaching for aspiring wildlife photographers. I had dinner plans with Robert, coffee dates with Linda, and a weekend visit scheduled with Margaret. My life was full of people and activities I'd chosen because they aligned with my values and interests. My relationships were based on mutual respect and shared passions, rather than obligation or dependency. My days were structured around contribution and growth, rather than crisis management and problem-solving for others. At 66 years old, I was finally living authentically, and that authenticity had created space for my children to do the same. We'd all learned that love isn't about being indispensable to each other. It's about being whole individuals who choose to share the fullness of who we are. The last entry in my journal that night read, "Today I spoke to 300 people about the importance of protecting endangered species, but the most endangered species I ever saved was myself. And in doing so, I discovered that my children didn't need to be saved after all. They just needed space to save themselves." 6 months later, Samuel Henderson called with news that would put our family's transformation to its ultimate test. "Elena, I need to inform you about a development regarding your estate planning. You've been selected for a tax audit that will require detailed documentation of all your financial transactions over the past 3 years." I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, but it was manageable rather than overwhelming. The old Elena would have immediately called her children to share the burden of worry. The new Elena took a deep breath and focused on problem solving. "What specifically do they need, Samuel?" "Documentation of all charitable giving, explanations for the changes to your will, records of the foundation establishment, justification for the various trust fund modifications. It's quite extensive. When do they need this information? You have 90 days to compile everything. Elena, I have to warn you, this kind of audit can be quite intrusive. They'll be looking at every financial decision you've made since Marcus passed away." After hanging up, I sat quietly for a few minutes, considering how to handle this challenge. Then I did something that would have been impossible 3 years ago. I decided not to burden my children with this problem, unless and until it became necessary to involve them. I spent the next week gathering documents, organizing records, and preparing detailed explanations for every financial decision I'd made during my transformation. The process was actually illuminating, forcing me to reflect on the journey from desperate widow to independent philanthropist. The records told the story clearly. A woman who had initially used money to maintain inappropriate levels of involvement in her adult children's lives, then completely redirected her resources toward personal growth and meaningful charitable work, finally emerging as someone who used wealth strategically to support causes she believed in and people she genuinely wanted to help. When the audit was complete 6 weeks later, the IRS agent assigned to my case was impressed rather than suspicious. "Mrs. Matthews, I have to say this is one of the most straightforward audits I've ever conducted. Your charitable giving is well documented and clearly motivated by genuine passion rather than tax avoidance strategies. Your foundation is properly structured and obviously focused on legitimate charitable work. Everything is exactly what it appears to be. Thank you. I've tried to be very intentional about how I use my resources." 5 years had passed since my Antarctic expedition, and the morning light filtering through my kitchen windows illuminated a scene that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Rebecca sat at my counter feeding breakfast to her 18-month-old daughter Lily, while David packed lunch for his teaching day. Victoria was reviewing legal documents for an animal rights case while her coffee grew cold, her usual habit when work captivated her attention. Thomas typed rapidly on his laptop, crafting marketing copy for a conservation nonprofit that had hired his firm. The kitchen was full of people, but the energy was completely different from those desperate Sunday brunches of years past. No one needed rescuing, managing, or financial support. They were here because they chose to be, starting their week with family connection before heading to work they genuinely loved. "Grandma Elena, Lily took her first steps yesterday," Rebecca said, lifting her daughter to show off her wobbly walking skills. David caught it on video. I watched my granddaughter toddle across the kitchen, her face bright with pride at her new accomplishment. At 71, I was experiencing grandmotherhood in a way I could never have imagined during my years of anxious over-involvement with my own children. "She's magnificent, sweetheart, and look how steady she's getting already." "Mom, we wanted to ask you about something," Victoria said, setting down her legal brief. "The law firm is expanding our animal rights division, and we're looking for a wildlife photographer to document cases involving habitat destruction and illegal hunting. Would you be interested in consulting with us?" I poured myself coffee from the pot Thomas had made, considering the offer. My photography career had evolved significantly since those early days of learning camera settings in community college classes. Now I was internationally recognized for my conservation work, with images displayed in museums and used in major environmental campaigns. "What kind of consulting work specifically?" Evidence documentation for legal cases, but also creating visual materials that help judges and juries understand the impact of environmental crimes on wildlife populations. That sounds like meaningful work that would use my skills in service of something I care about. But I need to know that you're hiring me because I'm qualified, not because I'm your mother. Victoria smiled, the kind of genuine expression that had replaced her old performative pleasantness. Mom, you're one of the most respected wildlife photographers in the country. We wouldn't risk our professional reputation by hiring someone based on family connections rather than expertise. Then yes, I'd be very interested in discussing the details. Thomas looked up from his laptop. Actually, this ties in perfectly with something I wanted to tell you all. The marketing firm has been approached by several environmental organizations about creating a coordinated campaign around wildlife protection laws. Having Elena's photography and Victoria's legal expertise could make us incredibly effective. And I could contribute artwork for fundraising materials and awareness campaigns, Rebecca added. Lily's nap schedule is pretty predictable now, so I have more time for commissioned work. As I listened to my children discuss how their various professional skills could complement each other in meaningful work, I felt a satisfaction that was entirely different from the desperate need for relevance I'd once experienced. They weren't including me because they felt obligated to, or because they needed my money to fund their projects. They were recognizing that I'd developed genuine expertise that could contribute to causes we all cared about. You know, I said, settling back in my chair with my coffee, 10 years ago I would have jumped at this opportunity because it meant you needed me for something. Today I'm interested because it sounds like intellectually challenging work that would make a real difference. That's exactly why we want to work with you, Thomas said. You bring professional competence, not just maternal enthusiasm. After my children left for their respective days, I sat in my garden, planning the schedule for my upcoming lecture tour. Universities across the country had been inviting me to speak about late-life career transitions, using my transformation from dependent mother to independent professional as a case study in reinvention. My phone rang, and Margaret's name appeared on the screen. Elena, I have news that's going to make you laugh and possibly make you very proud. Tell me, do you remember my daughter Sarah, the one who's been struggling with her mother-in-law interfering in her marriage? I did remember. Margaret had been sharing stories about Sarah's difficulties with boundaries for months, and I'd suggested some strategies based on my own experience learning to respect my children's independence. Sarah finally had a conversation with her mother-in-law about boundaries, using almost exactly the language you suggested. And do you know what her mother-in-law said? What? She said, "You sound just like Elena Matthews." I heard her speak at a conference about healthy family relationships, and it completely changed how I think about my role in my children's lives. I laughed, delighted by the unexpected connection. Small world. Elena, you've become something of a legend among women our age. People talk about your story as proof that it's never too late to reclaim your own life. I hope they also understand that reclaiming your own life doesn't mean abandoning the people you love. It means loving them in healthier ways. That's exactly the message people are getting. You've shown that you can maintain close family relationships while still being your own person. That afternoon, I drove to the Denver Animal Shelter for my regular volunteer shift, a commitment I'd maintained throughout all my career changes and family transitions. The work remained grounding and meaningful, connecting me to the values that had motivated my initial transformation. Elena, perfect timing. Janet called as I entered the building. We have a situation that could really use your expertise. She led me to the medical wing, where an injured golden eagle was recovering from what appeared to be gunshot wounds to its wing. Wildlife officials found her on private land where hunting should be prohibited. They think someone was illegally hunting raptors, but they need photographic evidence of her injuries for the legal case. I examined the magnificent bird, noting the specific pattern of her wounds and the way she held her damaged wing. This was exactly the kind of documentation work Victoria had been describing that morning. I can photograph her injuries in a way that will be compelling evidence for prosecution, but I'll need to coordinate with the wildlife officials to ensure the images meet legal standards for court use. Would you be willing to consult on this case? It could set important precedents for raptor protection. Absolutely. This is exactly the kind of work I want to be doing. 2 hours later, I had created a comprehensive photographic record of the eagle's injuries. working with veterinary staff to document the extent of the damage and the bird's chances for rehabilitation. The images would be crucial evidence in prosecuting whoever had shot this protected species. As I drove home, I reflected on how naturally this type of work fitted into my evolving career focus. My photography skills, my knowledge of wildlife behavior, my connections in the conservation community, and now my family's legal and marketing expertise were combining to create opportunities for impact I could never have imagined during my years of anxious mothering. That evening, Robert joined me for dinner, as had become our custom twice weekly over the past several years. Our friendship had deepened into something that was romantic without being possessive, supportive without being codependent. "How was your day?" he asked as we prepared salmon and vegetables together in my kitchen. "Professionally exciting, personally satisfying. My children want to hire me as a consultant for environmental legal work, and I documented evidence for a raptor shooting case at the shelter. Your life has become remarkably integrated. Your family relationships, your volunteer work, your professional photography, even your social connections all reinforce each other, rather than competing for your attention. That's what happens when you live authentically. Everything starts to fit together because it's all emerging from the same core values and interests. Do you ever miss the drama of your earlier years? The constant crises and interventions?" I considered his question while seasoning the fish. "I don't miss the anxiety or the feeling that I had to justify my existence by being indispensable to other people. But I do sometimes feel nostalgic for the intensity of feeling needed, even though I know that wasn't healthy for anyone. What replaced that intensity? A deeper satisfaction. Instead of the desperate high of being rescued from someone else's crisis, I get lasting fulfillment from contributing to meaningful work. Instead of the anxious pleasure of managing other people's problems, I enjoy the calm confidence of handling my own challenges competently. And instead of relationships based on need, you have relationships based on choice. Exactly, including ours." We ate dinner on my back porch, watching the sunset over the mountains that had become the backdrop for this completely unexpected chapter of my life. The conversation meandered through topics we both enjoyed: books we were reading, wildlife we'd observed, plans for upcoming travel. "Robert, there's something I want to discuss with you." "Of course. I've been invited to lead a photography expedition to the Galapagos Islands next spring. It's a 3-week commitment, working with a research team documenting how climate change is affecting endemic species." "That sounds incredible. Are you considering accepting?" "I am, but I wanted to talk with you about it first, since it would mean being away from home for an extended period." Robert smiled. "Elena, the fact that you're consulting with me shows how much you value our relationship, but I would never want to limit your professional opportunities. The Galapagos expedition sounds like exactly the kind of work you should be doing." "What about us, though?" 3 weeks is a long time to be completely out of communication. "We'll miss each other, but we'll both be here when you get back. That's what people do who love each other without possessing each other." The next morning, I called the expedition organizers to accept their invitation. Then I spent an hour researching the unique wildlife of the Galapagos, planning the equipment I would need, and preparing for what would likely be my most challenging and rewarding photography expedition yet. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Mom, the eagle case you documented yesterday is already generating interest from federal prosecutors. Your photos might be used to pursue charges under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Proud to be working with such a professional." A second message came from Thomas. "The conservation groups we work with are excited about potential collaboration with your photo documentation skills. This could be the beginning of a whole new service area for our firm." Rebecca sent a photo of Lily playing with finger paints, her little hands covered in bright colors. The message read, "Future artist in training. Thanks for showing all of us that creativity doesn't have an expiration date." I looked around my kitchen, where evidence of my multifaceted life was visible everywhere. Photography equipment, organized for the eagle documentation. Pottery pieces I'd made in recent classes. Travel guides for the Galapagos expedition. Foundation documents for our next board meeting. Volunteer schedules for the animal shelter. This was the life of someone who had learned to live authentically while maintaining meaningful connections to other people. Not the desperate enmeshment of my earlier years, but the healthy interdependence of people who chose to support each other's growth and dreams. At 71, I was busier and more fulfilled than I'd been in decades. My relationships with my children were deeper and more satisfying than they'd ever been when those relationships were based on their dependence on me. My romantic relationship with Robert was built on genuine compatibility rather than need. My friendships were connections between equals rather than service relationships where I gave and others received. I had learned that love without boundaries isn't really love, it's control dressed up in caring language. I had discovered that being needed isn't the same as being valued, and that the people who truly love us want us to be whole individuals, rather than extensions of their own needs. Most importantly, I had proven that it's never too late to discover who you really are when you stop trying to be who everyone else needs you to be. The woman I'd become through this process of forced independence was someone I genuinely liked and respected, someone whose life had meaning and impact that extended far beyond the people she loved. My children had given me the greatest gift possible when they told me they didn't need me anymore. They'd given me permission to become myself. And in becoming myself, I discovered that I had far more to offer the world than I'd ever imagined during my years of anxious caretaking. The journey from desperate mother to fulfilled individual had been painful but necessary. Now I was living proof that transformation is possible at any age, that healthy boundaries strengthen rather than weaken family relationships, and that authentic love creates space for everyone to grow into their fullest potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.